In the moonless nights of the South Pacific, where the ocean merged seamlessly with the sky, Japanese naval commanders sailed with absolute confidence. Their steel destroyers, towering and invincible, had swept through every engagement with overwhelming firepower. They controlled the sea lanes, dictated the terms of battle, and dismissed the Americans as a broken force retreating into insignificance. But in those same dark waters, something was stirring, something small, fast, and utterly unexpected. Wooden boats, barely longer than a city bus, powered by engines that screamed like banshees, were about to rewrite the rules of naval warfare. What the Japanese captains would soon discover was that size meant nothing when the enemy refused to be seen until it was already too late. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and the night itself would become the weapon. The year was 1942, and the Solomon Islands had become a graveyard of American ambitions. Stretching across thousands of miles of treacherous waters, this archipelago of volcanic peaks and dense jungle had transformed into the front line of a war that was slipping through Allied fingers. After the devastating losses at Pearl Harbor and the subsequent Japanese blitzkrieg across the Pacific, the United States Navy found itself in a position it had never anticipated, outgunned, outmaneuvered, and desperately searching for any tactical advantage that could stem the tide of Japanese expansion. The strategic situation was dire beyond measure. Japanese destroyers, cruisers, and fast transport vessels, collectively known as the Tokyo Express, or Rat Run, by frustrated American forces, operated with near impunity along the slot between the Solomon Islands. Every night, under the cover of darkness, these steel behemoths would race down from Rabaul, delivering troops, supplies, and reinforcements to Japanese garrisons, while simultaneously bombarding American positions on Guadalcanal with devastating accuracy. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express, but to the Marines dug into the muddy foxholes of Henderson Field, it was simply hell delivered on a schedule. American naval commanders faced an impossible equation. Their heavy cruisers and battleships were too valuable to risk in the narrow, reef-strewn waters, where Japanese destroyers operated with intimate knowledge of every current and shoal. Submarines, while effective in open ocean, struggled in the shallow, confined spaces of the island chains. Aircraft, dependent on daylight and clear weather, were useless against the nocturnal supply runs that kept Japanese forces fed and fighting. The enemy had found a tactical window that conventional American naval doctrine simply could not close. By mid-1942, the statistics painted a grim picture. Japanese destroyers were completing an average of 3 supply runs per week, delivering approximately 900 troops and 150 tons of supplies with each mission. American attempts to intercept these runs had resulted in catastrophic losses. The Battle of Savo Island alone had cost the U.S. Navy 4 heavy cruisers and over 1,000 sailors in a single night. The kill ratio was unsustainable, the strategic initiative was slipping away, and conventional wisdom offered no solutions. It was in this crucible of desperation that Lieutenant Commander John Bulkley, a wiry, intense officer with a reputation for aggressive tactics, stood before a skeptical audience of senior naval officers in Noumea, New Caledonia. On the table before him sat a scale model of what appeared to be little more than a recreational speedboat, 77 feet of plywood and mahogany, powered by 3 Packard engines that belonged in luxury automobiles, not warships. "Gentlemen," Bulkley began, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had already proven the impossible in the Philippines. "We've been trying to fight a heavyweight boxers match in a telephone booth. The Japanese own the night because we've conceded it to them. But what if we didn't need armor? What if we didn't need big guns? What if speed, darkness, and audacity were the only weapons that mattered?" The room erupted in barely concealed derision. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of amphibious forces in the South Pacific, voiced what many were thinking. "Commander, You're proposing we send wooden boats, boats that can be sunk by machine gun fire, against destroyers armed with 5-inch guns and torpedo batteries. This isn't warfare, it's suicide with extra steps. But Bulkley had faced this skepticism before. In the Philippines, his PT boats had evacuated General MacArthur from Corregidor, navigated 600 miles of Japanese-controlled waters, and lived to tell the tale. He knew something the admirals in their comfortable headquarters did not. The night was not the enemy's ally if you understood how to become part of it. "With respect, Admiral," Bulkley continued, placing photographs on the table. Grainy images of Japanese destroyers illuminated by sudden explosions. "These boats don't need to survive a slugging match. They need to get close enough to put 4 torpedoes into a target that never saw them coming, then disappear before the enemy can even train their guns. We're not building warships, we're building ambush predators." The concept was revolutionary and terrifying in equal measure. PT boats, patrol torpedo boats, were the antithesis of everything the US Navy had built its doctrine around. They displaced only 56 tons fully loaded compared to the 2,000-ton destroyers they would hunt. Their hulls were constructed of plywood laminated in multiple layers, a material chosen not for protection but for its ability to be quickly repaired and its surprising resilience against anything except direct hits. Their armament was laughably light by naval standards. 4 21-inch torpedoes, twin 50-caliber machine guns, and later a 37mm cannon that was more psychological weapon than ship killer. But what they lacked in armor and firepower, they compensated for with speed that bordered on the supernatural. Powered by 3 1,500-horsepower Packard engines, the same engines that powered the luxury cars of America's elite. These boats could achieve speeds exceeding 40 knots, making them faster than any destroyer afloat. In the confined waters of the Solomon Islands, where maneuverability mattered more than sustained firepower, this speed translated into something the Japanese had not encountered. An enemy that could choose when and where to fight, then vanish before retaliation was possible. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, a young officer from a prominent Boston family, sat in the back of the briefing room, absorbing every word. He had volunteered for PT boat duty precisely because it represented everything the traditional Navy was not: small unit leadership, independent action, and the kind of close-quarters combat that appealed to his sense of adventure. But even Kennedy, with his enthusiasm for unconventional warfare, understood the magnitude of what was being proposed. "Sir," Kennedy interjected, his Boston accent cutting through the murmurs of conversation, "what's the doctrine for engagement? How do we find targets in complete darkness without giving away our position?" Bulkley smiled. It was the right question, the one that separated those who understood from those who merely heard. "We don't find them, Lieutenant. We let them find themselves. The Japanese run on schedules. They follow predictable routes. They believe they own the night. We position ourselves along their known transit lanes, cut our engines, and wait. When they pass, and they will pass, we're already inside their defensive perimeter before they know we exist." The tactical concept was sound, but the execution would require a level of seamanship, courage, and coordination that had never been demanded of small boat crews. PT boat commanders would need to navigate by dead reckoning in total darkness, identify targets by silhouette and sound alone, launch torpedoes at ranges measured in hundreds of yards rather than thousands, and then escape through waters that might contain reefs, enemy vessels, or both. Commander Eric Barber, a veteran destroyer captain who had survived Savo Island, leaned forward with a mixture of respect and concern. "Commander Bulkley, I've seen what Japanese destroyers can do when they catch you in their searchlights. Their 5-inch guns can fire 15 rounds per minute. Their crews are trained for night combat in ways we're only beginning to understand. If even one of those searchlights catches your boats, you won't have time to regret the decision. That's precisely why we won't be there when the searchlights come on," Bulkley replied. "Our attack profile is simple. Approach at idle speed to minimize wake and engine noise. Close to within 500 yards, launch all 4 torpedoes in a spread pattern to maximize hit probability. Then go to full throttle and use our speed to open the range before they can react. By the time their searchlights sweep the area, we're already a mile away, lost in the darkness. The room fell silent as the implications settled in. This wasn't naval warfare as anyone had practiced it. This was something closer to piracy, to guerrilla tactics transplanted onto the ocean. It violated every principle of concentration of force, mutual support, and sustained firepower that had defined naval doctrine since the age of sail. And yet, in the specific circumstances of the Solomon Islands campaign, it might be the only thing that could work. Admiral William Halsey, newly appointed commander of South Pacific Forces and a man known for aggressive tactics, had been listening from the doorway. He stepped into the room, his presence immediately commanding attention. "Gentlemen, we've lost more tonnage and more men trying to fight the Tokyo Express with conventional methods than I care to calculate. Commander Bulkley is offering us something we desperately need, a way to make the Japanese pay a price for their nocturnal supply runs. I'm authorizing the formation of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 to be based at Tulagi, with operational authority to interdict enemy naval traffic in the slot. Commander Bulkley, you have 60 days to prove this concept works, or we'll reassign your boats to courier duty and forget this conversation ever happened." And so, in a headquarters building that still smelled of fresh paint and tropical mildew, the decision was made to unleash a weapon that would fundamentally alter the naval balance in the South Pacific. The PT boat squadrons would not win the war. That would require the massive industrial output and conventional naval power that America was only beginning to mobilize. But they would do something equally important. They would prove that the Japanese were not invincible, that the night could be contested, and that courage and innovation could overcome material disadvantage. Within weeks, PT boats began arriving at Tulagi, a small island across from Guadalcanal that served as the forward operating base for American naval forces. The boats were transported aboard cargo ships, their hulls carefully cradled to prevent damage, their engines meticulously maintained by crews who understood that mechanical failure in combat meant death. The base itself was primitive, little more than a fuel depot, a repair shed constructed from salvaged materials, and an operations hut where commanders plotted their nightly patrols. The crews who volunteered for PT boat duty were a unique breed. They were younger than average, with a median age of 23. They came from every corner of America, farm boys from Iowa who had never seen the ocean before enlisting, mechanics from Detroit who could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, college athletes who brought the competitive intensity of sports to the deadly serious business of naval combat. What united them was a willingness to embrace risk, a belief that small units could make a difference, and a certain reckless confidence that bordered on arrogance. Training was intense and unforgiving. Crews practiced navigation in complete darkness, learning to read the subtle differences in wave patterns that indicated reefs or shallow water. They rehearsed torpedo launches until the sequence, open tube doors, set depth and speed, calculate firing solution, launch, became muscle memory that could be executed in seconds. They studied Japanese destroyer silhouettes until they could identify vessel classes by the angle of their smokestacks and the spacing of their gun turrets. And they learned to work as a unit, because in the confined space of a PT boat, every man's survival depended on every other man's competence. But all the training in the world could not fully prepare them for what they were about to face. The Japanese destroyers of the Tokyo Express were not merchant vessels or lightly armed transports. They were frontline warships crewed by veterans who had fought from Pearl Harbor to the Java Sea, who had perfected the art of night combat, and who regarded American naval forces with a mixture of contempt and confidence born from months of uninterrupted victories. As the first PT boat patrols prepared to sortie into the slot, the crews understood they were attempting something that had never been done before, using boats that weighed less than a single destroyer turret to hunt vessels that could sink them with a single hit. The odds were absurd, the risks were existential, and the potential rewards were incalculable. Lieutenant Kennedy, standing on the deck of PT-109 as the sun set behind the volcanic peaks of Guadalcanal, turned to his executive officer and spoke words that would be echoed by every PT boat commander in the coming months. Tonight, we find out if David really can beat Goliath, or if that's just a story they tell to make people feel better about being outgunned. The engines rumbled to life, the distinctive sound of Packard power plants that would soon become the soundtrack of terror for Japanese naval forces. The boats slipped their moorings and headed into the gathering darkness, small wooden vessels carrying torpedoes, machine guns, and the hopes of a desperate campaign. Behind them, the lights of Tulagi faded into the night. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, the Tokyo Express was beginning its nightly run, unaware that the rules of engagement were about to change forever. When theory meets the unforgiving sea, the night of August 1st, 1942, marked the operational debut of motor torpedo boat Squadron 3 in the waters that would become their hunting ground, and for many, their grave. Lieutenant Commander Bulkley had divided his available boats into 3 divisions, each consisting of 4 PT boats that would patrol designated sectors of the slot. The narrow channel between the Solomon Islands, where Japanese destroyers ran their supply missions with clockwork regularity. PT-109, under the command of Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, was assigned to the Northern Patrol Sector alongside PT-157, PT-162, and PT-169. Their mission parameters were deceptively simple: intercept and destroy enemy naval traffic transiting southward toward Guadalcanal. The reality, as Kennedy and his crew would discover within hours, was infinitely more complex. The sea conditions that night were typical for the region. A moderate swell running from the southeast, scattered rain squalls that reduced visibility to near zero, and a humidity so oppressive that every metal surface dripped with condensation. The PT boats ran in a loose diamond formation, maintaining visual contact through the darkness by watching the faint phosphorescent wake each boat generated as it cut through the water. Ensign Leonard Tom, Kennedy's executive officer and a former Ohio State football player, crouched beside the helm station, his eyes straining to penetrate the darkness ahead. "Skipper, radar reports contact bearing 320, range approximately 8,000 yards, speed estimated at 30 knots. Multiple targets, possibly 4 vessels." Kennedy felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment when months of training would either validate the PT boat concept or expose it as a fatal delusion. "Signal the division. Prepare for attack run. We'll approach from the starboard quarter, use the rain squall at bearing 335 for concealment, then break into individual attack positions at 1,000 yards. The plan was textbook Bulkley doctrine. Use weather and darkness for concealment, close to point-blank range, overwhelm the target with multiple simultaneous torpedo attacks, then scatter before the enemy could coordinate a response. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it required a level of coordination and seamanship that would challenge even veteran crews. As the PT boats increased speed to intercept the approaching Japanese formation, the first complications emerged. The radar contact, primitive by later standards, flickered and faded as the boats maneuvered, making it impossible to maintain a continuous track on the enemy vessels. The rain squall that was supposed to provide concealment proved to be moving faster than anticipated, forcing Kennedy to recalculate his approach angle on the fly. "Range now 6,000 yards, Tom reported, his voice tight with tension. "They're maintaining course and speed. No indication they've detected us." Kennedy made a split-second decision that would define his command style for the rest of the war. "All boats reduce speed to 10 knots. We're going to let them close the range instead of burning fuel chasing them. Position ourselves across their projected track and wait. It was a gamble that violated the aggressive doctrine Bulkley had preached. But Kennedy's instinct told him that patience would yield a better firing solution than a high-speed stern chase. The 4 PT boats throttled back, their engines dropping to a low rumble that was barely audible over the sound of wind and waves. They spread out across a 2-mile front, each boat becoming a stationary ambush point in the darkness. 15 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The crew of PT-109 maintained absolute silence, every man straining to hear or see the approaching enemy. The torpedomen stood ready at their tubes, hands resting on the firing mechanisms, waiting for the order that would send 3,000 pounds of high explosive toward targets they couldn't yet see. Then, emerging from the darkness like apparitions, the Japanese destroyers appeared. They were running without lights, as expected, but their silhouettes were unmistakable. The distinctive pagoda-style superstructures, the raked funnels, the aggressive forward lean that characterized the Fubuki-class destroyers that formed the backbone of the Tokyo Express. Kennedy counted 4 vessels running in line-ahead formation, spaced approximately 500 yards apart, moving at what he estimated to be 28 knots. "Torpedoes ready," Kennedy whispered into the intercom, his voice barely audible. "Target is lead destroyer, set depth 6 feet, speed high. We'll fire all 4 tubes in a spread pattern. On my mark." The lead destroyer was now less than 800 yards away, close enough that Kennedy could see the white bow wave it generated as it sliced through the water. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. If the Japanese lookouts spotted the PT boat now, the destroyer's 5-inch guns could reduce the wooden hull to splinters before Kennedy could even give the order to fire. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3, fire 4. The PT boat shuddered as each torpedo launched, the compressed air ejection system sending the weapons into the water with a distinctive hiss and splash. Kennedy immediately ordered full throttle, and the Packard engines roared to life, pushing the boat to maximum speed as it turned hard to starboard, attempting to open the range before the Japanese could react. For 45 seconds, the estimated time for the torpedoes to reach their target, Kennedy and his crew held their breath, watching the darkness where the destroyer should be. Then, nothing. No explosion, no flash of light, no indication that any of the 4 torpedoes had found their mark. "Torpedoes missed," Tom reported, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Target is maintaining course and speed. They either didn't see them or the depth setting was wrong." Before Kennedy could respond, the night exploded into chaos. The second destroyer in the Japanese formation, having spotted the torpedo wakes, illuminated its searchlights, sweeping the water in a desperate attempt to locate the attackers. The beam caught PT-162, commanded by Lieutenant Henry Brantingham, fully exposed and less than 600 yards from the enemy formation. What happened next would be seared into the memory of every PT boat crew in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese destroyer's forward 5-inch gun turrets swiveled with terrifying speed, and within seconds, shells began falling around PT-162. The first salvo missed, sending geysers of water 50 feet into the air. The second salvo found its mark. A 5-inch shell struck PT-162 just aft of the helm station, penetrating the thin plywood hull and detonating inside the engine compartment. The explosion was catastrophic. Fuel lines ruptured, engines disintegrated, and the boat's stern section simply ceased to exist. Within 30 seconds, PT-162 was sinking, her bow pointing skyward as the shattered stern dragged her down. Kennedy watched in horror as the searchlight beams swept past his own boat, missing them by less than 50 yards. "All engines full. Steer 270. Get us into that rain squall," he shouted, abandoning any pretense of radio silence. The PT-109 leaped forward, her engines screaming at maximum power, throwing a rooster tail of spray 30 feet into the air. Behind them, the Japanese destroyers were now fully alert, their searchlights sweeping the water in coordinated patterns, their guns firing at anything that resembled a target. Tracer rounds from their anti-aircraft batteries created streams of light that crisscrossed the darkness, turning the night into a deadly light show. PT-157 and PT-169, having also launched their torpedoes with no confirmed hits, were now engaged in desperate evasion maneuvers. The Japanese destroyers, rather than continuing their supply run, had turned to pursue the attackers, their superior speed allowing them to close the range, despite the PT boat's frantic attempts to escape. For 20 minutes, the chase continued. A nightmare of near misses, mechanical failures, and split-second decisions that meant the difference between survival and death. PT-169, commanded by Lieutenant Philip Potter, suffered a catastrophic engine failure when a cooling line ruptured, reducing her speed to less than 15 knots. The pursuing destroyer closed rapidly, its searchlight locking onto the crippled boat. Potter made the only decision available to him. Abandon ship. Everyone over the side, now. The crew of PT-169 jumped into the water seconds before a salvo of 5-inch shells obliterated their boat, turning 77 feet of plywood and mahogany into an expanding cloud of splinters and burning fuel. The men in the water watched their boat die, then began the desperate swim toward the nearest island, knowing that Japanese destroyers rarely stopped to pick up survivors. Kennedy, having successfully reached the concealment of the rain squall, throttled back and listened to the chaos on the radio. 2 boats lost, no confirmed enemy hits, and a Japanese destroyer force that was now fully alert and hunting for additional targets. The first operational patrol of motor torpedo boat Squadron 3 had been a disaster. As dawn approached and the surviving PT boats limped back to Tulagi, the full cost of the night's action became clear. PT-162 had gone down with 4 crew members, including Lieutenant Brantingham. PT-169's crew had survived, but they had spent 6 hours in shark-infested waters before being rescued by a passing patrol boat. The 2 surviving boats, PT-109 and PT-157, had expended all their torpedoes without achieving a single confirmed hit. Commander Bulkley was waiting on the dock as Kennedy tied up, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Report, Lieutenant." Kennedy climbed onto the dock, his uniform soaked with salt water and fuel, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Sir, we engaged 4 enemy destroyers at ranges between 600 and 800 yards. We fired 16 torpedoes total, 0 confirmed hits. We lost 2 boats and 4 men. The enemy continued their supply run without significant delay." Bulkley was silent for a long moment, staring out at the water where the sun was beginning to rise over the volcanic peaks of Guadalcanal. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but intense. "Gentlemen, we have just learned the most expensive lesson in naval warfare. Theory and practice are separated by an ocean of blood. Our torpedoes are running too deep. The depth settings we were given are wrong. Our radar is inadequate for targeting in these conditions. Our coordination protocols break down the moment the enemy opens fire. And our boats, for all their speed, are death traps if caught in a searchlight beam." He turned to face the assembled officers, his eyes moving from face to face. "But here's what we also learned. We can get close. We can achieve surprise. We can force the enemy to react. What we need now is not different boats or different tactics. We need to fix the problems we've identified and try again. Because the alternative is to concede the night to the Japanese, and that is not an option." Over the following weeks, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 underwent a brutal process of adaptation and learning. Torpedomen discovered that the Mark 8 torpedoes they were using had depth-keeping mechanisms that were fundamentally flawed. Torpedoes set to run at 6 feet were actually running at 12 to 15 feet, passing harmlessly beneath the shallow draft destroyers they were targeting. The solution was crude but effective. Set the torpedoes to run at 0 feet, accepting the risk of surface running in exchange for a higher probability of hitting the target. The radar systems, primitive by any standard, were supplemented with a network of coastwatcher stations. Australian and native Solomon Islander observers positioned on high ground throughout the islands, equipped with radios and trained to report Japanese ship movements. This human intelligence network proved far more reliable than the temperamental radar sets, providing PT boat commanders with advance warning of enemy movements and allowing them to position themselves for optimal attack geometry. The coordination protocols were completely rewritten. Instead of attempting to maintain formation during attacks, PT boats would now operate as independent hunters, each commander free to maneuver as circumstances dictated. The only requirement was that all boats in a division would attack within a 5-minute window, creating multiple threats that would overwhelm the enemy's ability to respond effectively. But the most significant change was psychological. The crews of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had looked into the abyss and survived. They had seen their boats destroyed, their friends killed, and their tactics proven inadequate. And rather than breaking them, the experience had forged them into something harder, more focused, and infinitely more dangerous. Lieutenant Kennedy, sitting in the operations hut and reviewing after-action reports, understood that they had crossed a threshold. The romantic notion of PT boat warfare, dashing young officers in fast boats, striking boldly at the enemy, had been replaced by a grimmer reality. This was going to be a war of attrition, of incremental improvements, of learning from every mistake, because the cost of not learning was measured in lives. "We go out again tonight," Bulkley announced, entering the hut with a fresh set of intelligence reports. Coast watchers report 4 destroyers departing Rabaul, estimated arrival in the slot at 0200 hours. We'll position 6 boats across their projected track. New torpedo depth settings, new attack protocols, and one additional change. We're adding smoke generators to each boat. If we get caught in a searchlight, we lay smoke and use it for concealment while we evade. Kennedy looked up from his reports, his eyes meeting Bulkley's. "Sir, the men are exhausted. We've been running patrols every night for 2 weeks. We've lost 3 boats and 11 men. Morale is exactly what it needs to be," Bulkley interrupted. "These men volunteered for this duty because they wanted to make a difference. Tonight, they get another chance, and this time, we're going to sink something." As darkness fell over Tulagi and the PT boats prepared for another patrol, the crews moved with the mechanical efficiency of men who had done this too many times. They checked their torpedoes, tested their engines, loaded their machine guns, and said their private prayers. They were no longer the eager volunteers who had arrived weeks earlier, full of confidence and untested courage. They were combat veterans now, hardened by failure and driven by the need to prove that their sacrifices had meaning. The boats slipped their moorings and headed into the slot, their engines rumbling in the darkness, their crews silent and focused. Somewhere ahead, the Tokyo Express was beginning its nightly run, unaware that the hunters they had bloodied were coming back for another round. The night belonged to no one yet, but before dawn, that would change. When certainty crumbles in the darkness, Captain Tamichi Hara stood on the bridge of the destroyer Shigure, his hands clasped behind his back in the rigid posture that defined Imperial Japanese Navy officers. It was September 15, 1942, and Hara was leading his 4th Tokyo Express run of the month, a routine supply mission that had become as predictable as the tides. His formation consisted of 4 destroyers, Shigure, Shiratsuyu, Yugura, and Amagiri, each loaded with troops, ammunition, and supplies destined for the beleaguered Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal. The night was moonless, the sea calm, and Hara felt the comfortable confidence of a man who had executed this mission dozens of times without significant opposition. American cruisers and battleships were too cautious to venture into these confined waters at night. American aircraft were blind in the darkness. The only threats were submarines, and Hara's destroyers were equipped with sonar and depth charges, specifically designed to counter that danger. "Maintain course 185, speed 28 knots, Hara ordered, his voice carrying the casual authority of routine. "Lookouts remain alert for submarine periscopes. All gun crews at standard readiness." What Captain Hara did not know, what no Japanese naval officer yet understood, was that the rules of engagement in the Solomon Islands had fundamentally changed. The Americans had learned from their catastrophic failures, adapted their tactics, and were now hunting with a patience and precision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. 6 miles ahead of Hara's formation, Lieutenant Kennedy sat in the darkened cockpit of PT-109. His boat, positioned in a carefully calculated ambush point based on intelligence from coastwatcher stations. He was not alone. 5 other PT boats were spread across a 3-mile front, each positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would turn the narrow channel into a killing zone. This time, there would be no premature attacks, no wasted torpedoes, no panic when the searchlights came on. The new doctrine was brutally simple. Wait until the enemy was so close that missing was impossible. Fire every torpedo simultaneously to create multiple threats, then use smoke and speed to escape before the enemy could coordinate a response. "Contact confirmed," whispered Ensign Tom, his eyes glued to the primitive radar scope. 4 vessels bearing 350, range 4,000 yards, speed 28 knots. They're right on schedule. Kennedy felt a cold calm settle over him, the same sensation he had experienced during football games at Harvard, when the chaos of the field suddenly resolved into crystal clarity. "Signal all boats. Hold fire until range is 500 yards. Repeat, 500 yards. No one breaks discipline." The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. The Japanese destroyers, running dark and confident, approached the ambush point with no indication they suspected anything unusual. On the bridge of Shigur, Captain Hara was reviewing the supply manifest, calculating the most efficient unloading sequence for when they reached Guadalcanal. At 02:17 hours, the lead destroyer crossed the invisible threshold that Kennedy had designated as the firing point. The range was now 480 yards, close enough that the massive steel hull of the Shigur filled Kennedy's vision, close enough that he could see individual sailors moving on the deck. All boats, fire at will. Execute, execute, execute. 24 torpedoes launched simultaneously from 6 different positions, creating a spread pattern that covered every possible evasion maneuver the Japanese destroyers could attempt. The weapons entered the water with barely a splash, their electric motors driving them toward targets that had no idea they were under attack. On the bridge of Shigur, the first indication of danger came from a lookout who spotted a torpedo wake passing down the port side, missing by less than 20 feet. Before he could even shout a warning, 2 more torpedoes struck the destroyer Shiratsuyu amidships, the explosions occurring within seconds of each other. The effect was catastrophic. The first torpedo detonated against the forward engine room, rupturing steam lines and killing every man in the compartment instantly. The second torpedo struck just aft of the bridge, penetrating deep into the ship's hull before exploding with enough force to lift the 2,000-ton destroyer partially out of the water. Shiratsuyu's keel broke with a sound like a giant tree snapping, and the destroyer began to fold in on itself, her bow and stern rising as the shattered midsection sank. Captain Hara watched in absolute shock as his second ship died in less than 30 seconds. His mind, trained in the rigid doctrines of the Imperial Japanese Navy, struggled to process what he was seeing. Torpedoes meant submarines, but submarines attacked from distance, not point-blank range. Submarines gave warning, created disturbances in the water, showed periscope wakes. This attack had come from nowhere, with no warning and with a precision that seemed impossible. All ships, emergency turn to starboard. Activate searchlights. Sonar, locate the submarine. Hara's orders came rapidly, but they were based on assumptions that were fundamentally wrong. The searchlights blazed to life, sweeping the water in desperate arcs, searching for periscopes that didn't exist. What they found instead were small, fast-moving shapes that seemed to materialize from the darkness, then vanish before the gun crews could even train their weapons. These were not submarines. These were something the Japanese had never encountered in these waters, something that violated every assumption about American naval capabilities. Lieutenant Commander Hanao Shibuya, captain of the destroyer Yugure, was the first to understand what they were facing. Through his binoculars, he caught a glimpse of PT-109 as it raced away from the attack point, its 3 engines throwing a massive rooster tail of spray that glowed phosphorescent in the darkness. "Motor torpedo boats!" Shibuya shouted into the radio. "We're being attacked by American motor torpedo boats, multiple contacts, high speed, operating independently." The revelation sent a shockwave through the Japanese formation. Motor torpedo boats were not supposed to be in the Solomon Islands. Intelligence reports had placed them in the Philippines, in New Guinea, in secondary theaters where they posed nuisance value but no strategic threat. The idea that the Americans had deployed them here in the primary combat zone and had trained them to operate with this level of coordination and lethality was simply not part of Japanese naval planning. Captain Hara made a decision that would be debated in Japanese naval circles for the remainder of the war. Rather than continuing the supply run, rather than attempting to destroy the attackers, he ordered a full retreat. "All ships, come about to course 005, maximum speed. We return to Rabaul immediately." It was a decision born of uncertainty and fear, 2 emotions that Japanese naval doctrine did not accommodate. Hara had no idea how many PT boats were operating in the area. He had no doctrine for engaging them in darkness. He had just watched one of his destroyers sink in less than a minute, and he had no guarantee that more torpedoes weren't already in the water, tracking toward his remaining ships. As the Japanese destroyers turned and fled northward, their searchlights still sweeping the water in futile attempts to locate targets that were already miles away, the PT boat crews watched in amazement. They had not only achieved their first confirmed kill, they had done something far more valuable. They had injected doubt and fear into an enemy that had operated with absolute confidence for months. Lieutenant Kennedy, watching the Japanese destroyers disappear into the northern darkness, felt a surge of emotion that was equal parts relief and vindication. Signal base. Shiratsuyu-class destroyer sunk. Position EU8 to 15 south, 159 to 42 east. 3 enemy destroyers retreating northward at high speed. No friendly casualties. Mission accomplished. But the true impact of that night's action would not be measured in tonnage sunk or missions aborted. It would be measured in the reports that began flowing into Japanese naval headquarters in Rabaul. Reports that painted a picture of an enemy capability that simply should not exist. Commander Toshikazu Omai, Chief Intelligence Officer for the 8th Fleet, sat in his office reading the after-action reports from the September 15th engagement, his expression growing increasingly troubled. The reports were consistent in their basic facts. American motor torpedo boats had ambushed a Tokyo Express run, sunk 1 destroyer, and forced the others to abort their mission, but they were wildly inconsistent in their details. Captain Hara reported engaging at least 6, possibly 8 PT boats. Commander Shibuya reported 4 to 6 boats. The surviving crew members of Shiratsuyu, rescued from the water by the retreating destroyers, reported seeing dozens of small boats surrounding them in the darkness. The torpedo count was equally confused. Some reports claimed 12 torpedoes in the water, others claimed 20 or more. Ome understood that combat reports were always unreliable, that men under stress saw threats that didn't exist and missed threats that did. But the pattern emerging from these reports suggested something more troubling. The Americans had developed a capability that Japanese doctrine had no answer for. He drafted a memorandum to Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet, outlining his concerns. The American motor torpedo boat threat in the Solomon Islands represents a significant tactical problem that requires immediate doctrinal response. These vessels operate with a level of coordination and aggression that suggests extensive training and specialized tactics. Their ability to achieve surprise at close range, deliver multiple torpedo attacks simultaneously, and evade counterattack suggests they are purpose-built for operations in confined waters. Recommend immediate development of counter-tactics and deployment of specialized anti-small craft weapons. Admiral Mikawa read the memorandum with the skepticism of a man who had spent 30 years in a navy that prized large ship actions and decisive fleet engagements. Motor torpedo boats were, in his view, a minor irritant, dangerous in specific circumstances, but not a strategic threat that warranted major doctrinal changes. "Commander Omae," Mikawa said, his tone dismissive, "we have lost one destroyer to these boats in dozens of supply runs. This is an acceptable loss rate. Our captains will adapt their tactics. More aggressive use of searchlights, more alert lookouts, perhaps adding additional machine gun positions for close-range defense. But I will not divert resources from our primary mission to chase wooden boats in the darkness." It was a decision that would prove catastrophically wrong, but in September 1942, with Japanese forces still holding the initiative across the Pacific, it seemed reasonable. The Tokyo Express would continue its runs, Japanese captains would be more alert, and the PT boat threat would be managed rather than eliminated. But on the American side, the success of September 15th had transformed Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 from an experimental unit into a proven weapon. Commander Bulkley's after-action report to Admiral Halsey was succinct and powerful. PT boats have demonstrated capability to interdict enemy supply runs in confined waters where conventional naval forces cannot operate effectively. Recommend immediate expansion of PT boat operations and deployment of additional squadrons to the Solomon Islands theater. Halsey, always aggressive and always willing to embrace unconventional tactics, approved the recommendation immediately. Within weeks, additional PT boats were being shipped to the South Pacific, new crews were being trained in the hard-won lessons of the early patrols, and the doctrine for PT boat operations was being refined and distributed throughout the fleet. But perhaps the most significant impact of the September 15th engagement was psychological. Japanese destroyer captains, who had previously regarded the Tokyo Express runs as routine and relatively safe, now approached the Solomon Islands with a heightened sense of vulnerability. They increased speed through the danger zones, posted additional lookouts, and maintained a level of alertness that was exhausting for crews who were already operating at the limits of endurance. Captain Hara, in a private letter to a fellow officer that would later be captured and translated by American intelligence, wrote, "The Americans have found a way to make the night our enemy rather than our ally. These small boats appear from nowhere, strike with devastating effect, and vanish before we can respond. It is like fighting ghosts. We know they are there, we know they are dangerous, but we cannot see them until it is too late. Our men are exhausted from constant vigilance, and still the boats come. I do not know how to defeat an enemy I cannot find." This sense of helplessness, this erosion of confidence, was exactly what the PT boat campaign was designed to achieve. The boats themselves were not going to win the war. They lacked the firepower and the numbers to destroy the Japanese fleet. But they could make the Japanese pay a price for every supply run, force them to divert resources to defensive measures, and create an environment of constant threat that degraded operational effectiveness. In the operations hut at Tulagi, Lieutenant Kennedy stood before a map of the Solomon Islands, marking the locations of successful attacks with red pins and failed patrols with blue pins. The pattern was becoming clear. The PT boats were most effective when they could achieve complete surprise, when they could position themselves along known enemy transit routes, and when they could coordinate multiple attacks to overwhelm the enemy's ability to respond. "We're not fighting a naval war anymore," Kennedy said to Ensign Tom, who was reviewing the latest intelligence reports. "We're fighting a psychological war. Every time we force a Tokyo Express run to turn back, every time we sink a destroyer, every time we make them afraid of the darkness, we're winning even if we don't sink anything, because they're operating in our environment now and they don't know the rules." It was a profound insight, one that would define PT boat operations for the remainder of the war. The boats were not conventional naval vessels. They were instruments of psychological warfare, designed to create uncertainty, fear, and operational paralysis in an enemy that had grown accustomed to dominating the night. As September turned to October, and the campaign in the Solomon Islands intensified, the PT boats continued their nightly patrols, racking up an impressive tally of sunk and damaged vessels. But more importantly, they had achieved something that no amount of conventional naval power had managed. They had made the Japanese afraid of the darkness, and in doing so, they had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the South Pacific. The hunters had become the haunted, and the night would never belong to them again. The night, everything nearly fell apart. October 23, 1942, began with intelligence reports that sent a chill through every officer in Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. Japanese naval forces were planning their largest supply operation to date, a convoy of 8 destroyers, 2 cruisers, and multiple transport vessels, all converging on Guadalcanal in a coordinated effort to deliver over 4,000 troops and enough supplies to sustain Japanese forces for 3 months. It was an overwhelming force, one that represented the Japanese determination to retake Henderson Field and drive the Americans from the Solomon Islands permanently. Commander Bulkley stood in the operations hut, staring at the intelligence map with an expression that mixed determination with barely concealed concern. He had 12 operational PT boats available, 12 wooden vessels, each carrying 4 torpedoes, facing a Japanese armada that could obliterate them with a single coordinated salvo. "Gentlemen," Bulkley addressed the assembled PT boat commanders, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to order, "we are going to do something that every tactical manual says is suicide. We are going to attack this convoy with everything we have, and we are going to make them believe they're facing a force 10 times our actual size." Lieutenant Kennedy, standing at the back of the room, felt the familiar knot of tension in his stomach. He had survived 4 major engagements, watched friends die, and learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. "Sir, if we commit all 12 boats to a single engagement and the Japanese coordinate their defensive fire, we could lose the entire squadron in 1 night." "That's correct, Lieutenant," Bulkley replied, his eyes meeting Kennedy's without flinching. "But if we don't stop this convoy, Henderson Field falls. If Henderson Field falls, Guadalcanal falls. If Guadalcanal falls, we lose the Solomon Islands, and the Japanese consolidate their defensive perimeter to a point where it will take us years to break through. So yes, we're risking everything, because everything is at stake." The plan that emerged from that meeting was audacious to the point of recklessness. The 12 PT boats would be divided into 4 divisions of 3 boats each. They would attack in waves, spaced 15 minutes apart, creating the illusion of a much larger force. Each division would approach from a different direction, forcing the Japanese to divide their defensive fire. And most critically, they would employ a new tactic that had never been tested in combat: coordinated smoke screens combined with high-speed evasion maneuvers designed to create maximum confusion. But even as the plan was being finalized, a crisis emerged that threatened to derail the entire operation. Chief Machinist's mate Patrick "Pappy" McMahon, the senior enlisted man responsible for maintaining the PT boat engines, entered the operations hut with news that no one wanted to hear. "Commander, we have a critical fuel problem. The last shipment we received was contaminated with water and sediment. I've got engine crews working around the clock to clean fuel lines and filters, but we're looking at a 30% reduction in operational range. Some boats might not have enough fuel to make it back to base if they have to run at maximum speed for extended periods." The room fell silent. Fuel was the lifeblood of PT boat operations. Without it, speed meant nothing, and speed was their only defense against the overwhelming firepower they would face. Bulkley's mind raced through the options, each one worse than the last. They could abort the mission, but that meant conceding the night to the Japanese. They could reduce the number of boats committed, but that would reduce their effectiveness below the threshold needed to disrupt the convoy. Or they could proceed with the mission and accept that some boats might run out of fuel in enemy-controlled waters, leaving their crews stranded and vulnerable. "How long until you can guarantee clean fuel for all boats?" Bulkley asked, his voice tight with controlled tension. 48 hours minimum, sir. We need to drain every tank, flush the lines, and refill with verified clean fuel. It's not something we can rush without risking catastrophic engine failure in the middle of combat." Bulkley looked at the map, at the projected timeline for the Japanese convoy, and made a decision that would define his command legacy. "We don't have 48 hours. The convoy arrives tonight. Here's what we're going to do. Every boat carries extra fuel in jerry cans lashed to the deck. We establish a refueling point at Savo Island. It's halfway between here and the intercept point. Boats that are running low can detach, refuel from the jerry cans, and rejoin the fight. It's not elegant, but it keeps us in the battle." Lieutenant Commander Henry Brantingham, who had survived the sinking of PT-162 and now commanded PT-191, raised the obvious objection. "Sir, jerry cans on deck are a massive fire hazard. Untrace around one shell fragment, and the entire boat becomes a floating bomb." "I'm aware of the risk, Commander," Bulkley replied, "but the alternative is to let the Japanese land 4,000 troops unopposed. I'll take the fire hazard." As the sun set on October 23rd and the PT boats prepared for what would become known as the Battle of the Slot, the crews worked with frantic intensity to prepare their vessels. Fuel lines were flushed and reflushed. Torpedoes were checked and rechecked. Machine guns were loaded with a mixture of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, and on the deck of each boat, secured with rope and prayer, sat 4 jerry cans containing 20 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel each, enough to extend their range and enough to turn them into floating funeral pyres if anything went wrong. PT-109, with Kennedy at the helm, led the 1st Attack Division. Alongside him were PT-157 under Lieutenant William Liebenau and PT-171 under Lieutenant John Searles. Their mission was to penetrate the Japanese screen and attack the transport vessels, the high-value targets that carried the troops and supplies. At 21:45 hours, the Japanese convoy entered the slot, running in a formation that demonstrated both their confidence and their awareness of the PT boat threat. The 2 cruisers, Chokai and Kinugasa, formed the outer screen, their massive 8-inch guns trained outward, ready to engage any threat. Inside this protective barrier, the 8 destroyers formed a box around the 4 transport vessels, creating overlapping fields of fire that would shred any attacker that penetrated the outer screen. Kennedy studied the formation through his binoculars, his tactical mind analyzing angles of approach and probability of survival. The formation was nearly perfect. There were no obvious gaps, no weak points that could be exploited without accepting catastrophic risk. But there was one factor the Japanese couldn't control: the weather. A tropical squall was moving through the area, bringing sheets of rain that reduced visibility to less than 500 yards and created a curtain of water that radar couldn't penetrate effectively. It was the kind of weather that made conventional naval operations nearly impossible, but for PT boats, it was an opportunity. "We're going straight through the middle," Kennedy announced to his crew, his voice calm despite the insanity of what he was proposing. "We use the rain squall for concealment, run at idle speed until we're inside their formation, then go to full throttle and fire everything we have at the transports. By the time they figure out where we are, we'll already be gone." Ensign Tom, who had learned to trust Kennedy's instincts even when they seemed suicidal, simply nodded. "Aye, Skipper. Straight through the middle." The 3 PT boats entered the rain squall at 2203 hours, their engines throttled back to barely above idle, their crews maintaining absolute silence. The rain hammered against the plywood hulls with a sound like continuous drumming, masking the low rumble of their engines. Through the curtain of water, they could see the vague shapes of the Japanese vessels, massive steel shadows that seemed to fill the entire ocean. Kennedy navigated by instinct and dead reckoning, steering PT-109 between the outer screen of destroyers with a margin of error measured in yards. At one point, they passed so close to the destroyer Amagiri that Kennedy could see Japanese sailors on deck, their attention focused outward, never imagining that an enemy vessel was already inside their defensive perimeter. Then, emerging from the rain like a vision from a nightmare, the transport vessels appeared. 4 large cargo ships, each displacing over 5,000 tons, their holds packed with troops and supplies. They were less than 400 yards away, stationary targets that couldn't evade, even if they had warning. "Fire all tubes," Kennedy ordered, his voice cutting through the sound of rain and engines. 12 torpedoes, 4 from each PT boat, launched simultaneously, creating a spread pattern that covered all 4 transport vessels. The weapons entered the water and accelerated toward their targets, their electric motors driving them at 46 knots toward ships that had no idea they were under attack. The first torpedo struck the lead transport, Sasako Maru, below the waterline amidships. The explosion was massive, far larger than the torpedoes that had sunk the destroyer Shiratsuyu. The transport was loaded with ammunition, and when the torpedo detonated, it triggered a secondary explosion that literally tore the ship in half. The blast was so powerful that it shattered windows on the nearby cruiser Chokai and sent a mushroom cloud of fire and debris 500 feet into the air. The second and third torpedoes struck the transport Azumasan Maru within seconds of each other, both hitting near the engine room. The ship didn't explode. It simply stopped existing as a functional vessel, her keel broken, her hull flooding, her crew abandoning ship in panic. The fourth transport, Kyushu Maru, was struck by a single torpedo that detonated against her bow, blowing away the forward 50 feet of the ship and leaving her dead in the water, sinking slowly but inevitably. Kennedy didn't wait to observe the results. "All engines full. Steer 270. Lay smoke." The Packard engines roared to life, and PT-109 leaped forward, her smoke generator creating a dense white cloud that obscured her position as she raced away from the carnage. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. Every gun in the convoy opened fire, 5-inch destroyer guns, 8-inch cruiser guns, anti-aircraft batteries, machine guns, all firing at targets they couldn't see, creating a storm of steel that turned the water into a boiling cauldron of explosions and traces. PT-157, racing away from the attack point, took a 5-inch shell through her port engine compartment. The explosion killed 2 crew members instantly and set the boat on fire. Lieutenant Libanot, his uniform burning, gave the order to abandon ship seconds before the jerry cans on deck ignited, turning the PT boat into a fireball that could be seen for miles. PT-171 was luckier. A cruiser shell passed through her hull without detonating, leaving 2 perfectly round holes that flooded the forward compartment but didn't compromise her engines. Lieutenant Searles kept his boat at maximum speed, racing toward the safety of the rain squall, while his crew frantically worked to plug the holes with anything they could find: mattresses, life jackets, even their own uniforms. PT-109, with Kennedy at the helm, was threading through a maze of shell splashes and tracer fire, his hands moving on the wheel with the precision of a surgeon, making constant micro-adjustments that kept them just ahead of the Japanese gunfire. A destroyer searchlight locked onto them for 3 seconds, an eternity in combat, before Kennedy threw the boat into a hard turn that broke the lock and sent them back into the concealing darkness. Behind them, the Japanese convoy was in chaos. 3 of 4 transport vessels were sinking or already sunk. The destroyer screen was firing in all directions, their crews unable to distinguish between real threats and phantom contacts. The cruisers had ceased fire, their captains unwilling to risk hitting their own vessels in the confusion. And then, 15 minutes after the first attack, the second wave of PT boats struck from a completely different direction, launching another salvo of torpedoes that sank the 4th transport and damaged 2 destroyers. 50 minutes after that, the third wave attacked, and then the 4th, each assault coming from an unexpected direction, each creating the impression of an overwhelming American force that was everywhere and nowhere. By 00:100 hours on October 24th, the Battle of the Slot was over. The Japanese convoy, having lost all 4 transport vessels, 2 destroyers sunk and 3 more damaged, retreated northward at maximum speed. The planned reinforcement of Guadalcanal had been completely disrupted. Over 2,000 Japanese troops were in the water, clinging to debris and life rafts, waiting for rescue that would take hours to arrive. The cost to motor torpedo boat Squadron 3 had been severe. 2 boats lost, 9 men killed, and every surviving boat damaged to some degree. But they had achieved something that conventional naval forces had been unable to accomplish. They had stopped the Tokyo Express cold and proven that wooden boats, crewed by men who refused to accept the limitations of their equipment, could defeat an enemy that possessed overwhelming material superiority. As PT-109 limped back to Tulagi, her fuel tanks nearly empty, her hull riddled with shrapnel holes, Kennedy stood at the helm and watched the sun rise over Guadalcanal. Ensign Tom, his face blackened with smoke and exhaustion, spoke the words that every man on the boat was thinking: "We shouldn't have survived that. By every tactical calculation, we should all be dead." Kennedy nodded slowly, his hands still gripping the wheel, even though they were in safe waters now. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the reason we're winning is because we're doing things that no tactical calculation says we should survive. The Japanese fight by the book. We're writing a new book, 1 page at a time, in blood and fire. When the PT boats reached Tulagi, Commander Bulkley was waiting on the dock, his face drawn with the exhaustion of a commander who had sent men into battle knowing that some would not return. As Kennedy tied up and climbed onto the dock, Bulkley simply nodded. No words were necessary. They had gambled everything on a single night, and they had won. Within hours, Admiral Halsey's headquarters issued a communiqué that would be read throughout the Pacific Fleet. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 has successfully interdicted major Japanese reinforcement convoy, sinking 4 transport vessels and multiple escort ships. Enemy operation completely disrupted. PT boats have proven their value as offensive weapons in confined waters. Recommend immediate expansion of PT boat operations throughout the theater. BED. But perhaps the most significant impact of the Battle of the Slot was not measured in ships sunk or missions aborted. It was measured in the realization on both sides that the nature of naval warfare had fundamentally changed. Small, fast, expendable vessels, crewed by men willing to accept extraordinary risks, could achieve results that entire fleets could not. Innovation, audacity, and the willingness to break every rule in the tactical manual had become weapons as powerful as any gun or torpedo. The PT boats had entered the crucible of combat and emerged transformed, no longer an experimental concept, but a proven weapon that would shape the course of the Pacific War. The moment confidence becomes despair. The morning of November 8, 1942, dawned over the Japanese naval base at Rabaul with an atmosphere of tension that had become increasingly familiar to the officers of the 8th Fleet. In the operations room of the headquarters building, a structure hastily constructed from concrete and corrugated steel, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa sat reviewing casualty reports that told a story of systematic defeat. Since the Battle of the Slot on October 23rd, Japanese naval forces had attempted 17 separate Tokyo Express runs. Of those 17 attempts, only 4 had successfully delivered their cargo to Guadalcanal. The others had been turned back, damaged, or destroyed by American PT boats that seemed to multiply with each passing week. The numbers were stark and undeniable: 13 destroyers sunk or heavily damaged, 9 transport vessels lost, and over 6,000 troops who never reached their destination, drowned, captured, or scattered across the Solomon Islands. Commander Toshikazu Omai, the intelligence officer who had warned about the PT boat threat months earlier, stood before a map covered with red pins marking the locations of successful American attacks. The pattern was unmistakable. The Americans had transformed the slot from a Japanese highway into an American killing ground. "Admiral," Omai began, his voice carrying the weight of a man delivering news he knew would not be well received, "we must acknowledge that our current approach to the Solomon Islands supply problem is unsustainable. The Americans have achieved tactical superiority in night operations within confined waters. Our destroyer captains are exhausted, our crews are demoralized, and our losses are accelerating." Mikawa's face remained impassive, but his hands, clasped on the desk before him, tightened until the knuckles turned white. "Commander, are you suggesting that the Imperial Japanese Navy, which has dominated every naval engagement from Pearl Harbor to the Java Sea, cannot defeat wooden boats operated by inexperienced American crews?" "Sir, with respect, that is precisely what I am suggesting," Omai replied, his voice steady despite the career risk of such a statement. "These are not inexperienced crews anymore. They have been fighting in these waters for 3 months. They know every reef, every current, every hiding place. They have developed tactics specifically designed to exploit our weaknesses, and most critically, they are not afraid of us anymore." The last statement hung in the air like an accusation. Fear, or rather the enemy's lack of it, was perhaps the most troubling development of all. Japanese naval doctrine was built on the assumption of psychological dominance, the belief that superior training, superior equipment, and superior fighting spirit would intimidate opponents into making mistakes. But the PT boat crews had proven immune to intimidation. They attacked with a recklessness that bordered on suicidal, yet they survived through a combination of skill, luck, and intimate knowledge of the tactical environment. Captain Tamichi Hara, summoned to Rabaul to provide first-hand testimony, entered the operations room with the bearing of a man who had aged years in months. His destroyer, Shigure, had survived 4 separate PT boat attacks, but each engagement had taken a toll, not just in damage to his ship, but in the psychological state of his crew. "Admiral, Commander," Hara began, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, "I have commanded destroyers for 15 years. I have fought in every major engagement of this war, and I tell you with absolute certainty, we cannot win against these boats using conventional tactics. They do not fight like a navy, they fight like pirates, appearing from nowhere, striking with devastating effect and vanishing before we can respond." Mikawa leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Hara with an intensity that demanded complete honesty. "Captain, explain to me how wooden boats that can be destroyed by machine gun fire are defeating steel destroyers armed with the finest weapons in the world." Hara took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts into a coherent explanation of a tactical reality that defied traditional naval logic. "Sir, the PT boats exploit 3 fundamental advantages that our doctrine does not address. First, they achieve complete surprise by operating at ranges where our radar is ineffective, and our lookouts cannot distinguish them from wave patterns or debris. By the time we detect them, they are already inside our defensive perimeter. He moved to the map, tracing the typical attack pattern with his finger. Second, they attack in coordinated waves from multiple directions, forcing us to divide our defensive fire and creating confusion about the actual number of boats we are facing. In the engagement of November 2nd, my crew reported being attacked by at least 12 boats. Post-battle analysis suggests there were actually only 6, but the speed and coordination of their attacks created the illusion of a much larger force. And third, Hara continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, they have broken our psychological dominance. My men no longer believe they are invincible. They no longer trust that our superior firepower will protect them. Every night we enter the slot, they know there is a significant probability we will be attacked, and they know that if we are attacked, some of them will die. This constant stress is destroying crew effectiveness faster than any enemy action. The room fell silent as the implications of Hara's testimony settled over the assembled officers. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire strategic approach on the assumption of psychological and tactical superiority. If that assumption was no longer valid, if Japanese sailors were now more afraid than their American counterparts, then the entire foundation of their operational doctrine was compromised. Lieutenant Commander Yasumi Doi, a staff officer responsible for tactical planning, spoke up with a suggestion that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Admiral, perhaps we should consider abandoning the Tokyo Express entirely. We could supply Guadalcanal by submarine, or by high-speed seaplane, or by— Absolutely not, Mikawa interrupted, his voice sharp with anger. Abandoning the Tokyo Express would be an admission of defeat. It would signal to every unit in the Pacific that the Americans have found a way to neutralize our naval superiority. The strategic consequences would be catastrophic. But even as Mikawa spoke, he knew the truth that everyone in the room understood, but no one wanted to articulate. They had already been defeated. The Tokyo Express was no longer a reliable supply line. It was a gauntlet that cost more in ships and men than it delivered in supplies. The Americans had not won through superior firepower or better equipment. They had won through innovation, adaptation, and a willingness to accept risks that Japanese doctrine considered unacceptable. Commander Ohmai, sensing an opening in Mikawa's defensive posture, pressed his argument. Sir, I have obtained testimony from captured American PT boat crews. With your permission, I would like to share some of their statements. Mikawa nodded curtly, and Ohmai opened a folder containing translated interrogation transcripts. This is from Ensign George Ross, captured after his boat was sunk on October 28th. When asked about his training, he stated, "We trained for 6 weeks before being deployed. Most of that training was learning to navigate in darkness and how to approach targets without being detected. We were told that our survival depended on never being seen until we wanted to be seen." Ohmai turned to another page. This is from motor machinist's mate Harold Marney, captured in the same engagement. When asked about his fear of Japanese destroyers, he stated, "Sure, we're scared. But we're more scared of letting down the Marines on Guadalcanal. Those guys are dying because they don't have supplies. Every Japanese ship we sink is one less ship delivering troops to kill our guys. So yeah, we're scared, but we go out anyway." The testimony revealed something that Japanese intelligence had failed to grasp. The American PT boat crews were not fighting for abstract strategic objectives or national honor. They were fighting for their comrades, for the Marines dug into the mud of Guadalcanal, for the pilots flying from Henderson Field. This personal, immediate motivation created a level of commitment that Japanese doctrine, with its emphasis on abstract concepts of duty and honor, could not match. Captain Hara, listening to the translated testimony, felt a profound sense of recognition. "They have found their Bushido," he said quietly, using the Japanese term for the warrior code. Not our Bushido, but something equivalent. They fight not because they are ordered to, but because they believe their fighting matters. That is a formidable enemy. As the meeting continued, the officers of the Eighth Fleet grappled with a reality that was becoming increasingly undeniable. The tactical situation in the Solomon Islands had fundamentally shifted. The Americans had learned to fight in the darkness with a proficiency that matched or exceeded Japanese capabilities. They had developed weapons and tactics specifically designed for the confined waters of the island chains. And most critically, they had overcome their initial fear and uncertainty to become a confident, aggressive force that no longer conceded the night to their opponents. The statistical evidence was overwhelming. In September, Japanese supply runs had a 75% success rate. By November, that rate had dropped to 23%. The average tonnage delivered per run had decreased from 150 tons to less than 50 tons. The time required to complete a run had increased from 4 hours to 8 hours, as destroyer captains took increasingly circuitous routes to avoid known PT boat ambush points. And the psychological cost, measured in crew exhaustion, declining morale, and increasing reluctance to volunteer for Tokyo Express duty, was incalculable. Admiral Mikawa, faced with evidence he could no longer ignore, made a decision that would effectively concede American control of the waters around Guadalcanal. Effective immediately, all Tokyo Express runs will be conducted only under the following conditions: multiple destroyer escorts, cruiser support within range, and air cover available at first light for recovery operations. Any run that does not meet these criteria will be postponed. The new requirements were so restrictive that they effectively ended the Tokyo Express as a reliable supply operation. The additional escorts required resources that were needed elsewhere. The cruiser support exposed valuable capital ships to unnecessary risk, and the requirement for air cover meant that runs could only be conducted when weather permitted, eliminating the flexibility that had made the Tokyo Express effective in the first place. Commander Omai, understanding the significance of Mikawa's decision, asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Sir, if we cannot supply Guadalcanal by sea, how do we sustain our forces there?" Mikawa's response was delivered in a tone of resignation that was painful to hear from a senior Japanese naval officer. "We don't. We hold what we can hold, we evacuate what we cannot hold, and we establish a new defensive perimeter that we can actually defend. The Americans have won the battle for the Solomon Islands. Our task now is to ensure that victory costs them as much as possible and delays their advance toward the home islands." It was an admission of strategic defeat, delivered in a headquarters building thousands of miles from Tokyo, by officers who understood that the war they had started with such confidence was slipping inexorably beyond their ability to control. The PT boats had not won the war. That would require years of additional fighting and the massive industrial and military power that America was only beginning to deploy. But they had won something equally important. They had broken the myth of Japanese invincibility and proven that innovation, courage, and adaptation could overcome material disadvantage. As the meeting concluded and the officers filed out of the operations room, Captain Hara remained behind, staring at the map with its constellation of red pins marking American victories. He thought about the young American crews in their wooden boats, racing through the darkness with a confidence that his own men had lost. He thought about the tactical revolution they had achieved, not through superior equipment or overwhelming force, but through a willingness to fight in ways that conventional doctrine said were impossible. In a letter to his wife that would be found among his personal effects after the war, Hara wrote, "We have encountered an enemy that does not fight as we expected. They do not respect our superiority. They do not fear our weapons. They come at us in the darkness with wooden boats and iron determination, and they are winning. I do not know how this war will end, but I know that we have underestimated the Americans, and that underestimation may cost us everything. Across the slot, in the operations hut at Tulagi, Lieutenant Kennedy was briefing his crew for another patrol. The mood was confident, but not complacent. They had learned that every patrol could be their last, that survival required constant vigilance and a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. But they also knew, with a certainty born from repeated success, that they had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Solomon Islands. "Gentlemen," Kennedy said, looking at the faces of his crew, young men who had aged years in months, who had seen friends die and boats burn, who had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. The Japanese are changing their tactics. They're running fewer missions, using more escorts, and taking longer routes to avoid our ambush points. That means they're afraid of us, and as long as they're afraid, we're winning. It was a simple truth, but it captured the essence of what the PT boat campaign had achieved. They had not destroyed the Japanese fleet. They had not captured territory or won decisive battles. But they had done something equally valuable. They had made the enemy afraid. And in doing so, they had changed the course of the war. When the night finally belonged to no one, February 9th, 1943, marked the official end of the Tokyo Express. On that date, the last Japanese destroyer evacuated the final troops from Guadalcanal, concluding a campaign that had cost the Imperial Japanese Navy 24 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and over 12,000 sailors. The Americans had won the Solomon Islands, and while that victory required the combined efforts of Marines, Army infantry, naval surface forces, and air power, a disproportionate share of the credit belonged to the small wooden boats that had made the night a contested battleground. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy stood on the dock at Tulagi for the last time, watching as PT-109 was prepared for transport back to the United States. The boat that had carried him through dozens of patrols, that had survived attacks that should have destroyed her, was being decommissioned. Her hull too damaged, her engines too worn, her service record too distinguished to risk in further combat. Kennedy himself was being rotated home, his combat tour complete, his body bearing the scars of a war that had transformed him from an ambitious young officer into a hardened veteran. Commander Bulkley, now promoted to captain and assigned to establish PT boat training programs for the expanding Pacific campaign, joined Kennedy on the dock. The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun set over waters that had claimed so many lives and witnessed so much courage. "We changed the war," Bulkley said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and melancholy. "Not just tactically, but conceptually. We proved that small units, properly trained and led, could achieve strategic effects that entire fleets could not. Every PT boat squadron, now operating in the Pacific, and there are dozens of them, is using tactics we developed here, in these waters, through trial and error and blood." Kennedy nodded, his mind drifting back to the nights of terror and triumph, to the faces of men who had not survived, to the moments when survival seemed impossible but happened anyway. "Sir, what do you think the final assessment will be? When historians look back at what we did here, what will they say?" Bulkley considered the question carefully, understanding that Kennedy was asking not just about historical judgment, but about meaning, whether the sacrifices had been worth it, whether the victories had mattered. "They'll say we bought time. Time for the industrial might of America to mobilize. Time for the Marines to hold Guadalcanal. Time for the Navy to rebuild after Pearl Harbor. We didn't win the war, but we prevented the Japanese from winning it during the critical months when they still had the initiative." It was an accurate assessment, but it understated the psychological and doctrinal impact of the PT boat campaign. The lessons learned in the Solomon Islands had been codified into training manuals, tactical doctrines, and operational procedures that would be used throughout the Pacific War. The concept of small, fast attack craft operating independently in confined waters had been validated and would be replicated in every theater where geography favored such tactics. But perhaps the most significant legacy was not tactical, but human. The PT boat crews had demonstrated that ordinary men, given proper training and leadership, could accomplish extraordinary things. They had proven that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. And they had shown that innovation and adaptation could overcome material disadvantage, a lesson that would resonate far beyond the specific circumstances of the Solomon Islands campaign. In the months following the end of the Tokyo Express, American intelligence officers conducted extensive interviews with captured Japanese naval personnel, seeking to understand the enemy's perspective on the PT boat threat. The testimony they collected painted a picture of an enemy force that had been psychologically defeated before being militarily overcome. Captain Tamechi Hara, captured after his destroyer was sunk in a later engagement, provided perhaps the most insightful analysis during his interrogation. The PT boats did not defeat us through superior firepower or better equipment, Hara explained to his American interrogators. They defeated us by making us afraid of the darkness. Before the PT boats, we owned the night. We operated with confidence, knowing that American forces could not effectively engage us in darkness. The PT boats changed that calculation. They made every transit through the slot a gamble, every supply run a potential disaster. The psychological cost of that constant threat was more damaging than the actual ships they sank. This testimony confirmed what American commanders had suspected. The PT boat campaign had achieved effects far beyond the simple arithmetic of ships sunk and supplies interdicted. It had fundamentally altered Japanese operational planning, forcing them to divert resources to defensive measures, to take longer and less efficient routes, and to operate under a level of stress that degraded overall effectiveness. The statistical analysis conducted after the war provided quantitative validation of these qualitative assessments. Between August 1942 and February 1943, PT boats in the Solomon Islands conducted 347 combat patrols, engaged enemy forces in 89 separate actions, and fired 412 torpedoes. They sank or heavily damaged 43 Japanese vessels, including 16 destroyers, 14 transport ships, and 13 smaller craft. But more significantly, they forced the Japanese to abort or postpone 67 supply missions, preventing an estimated 28,000 tons of supplies and 15,000 troops from reaching Guadalcanal. The cost had been severe. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 lost 23 boats and 87 men killed in action during the 6-month campaign. The survival rate for PT boat crews in the Solomon Islands was 64%, meaning that more than 1 in 3 men who served on the boats were either killed or seriously wounded. It was a casualty rate that exceeded that of submarine crews and approached that of bomber crews in the European theatre. But those who survived carried with them lessons and experiences that would shape the remainder of the war. Lieutenant Kennedy, returning to the United States in March 1943, was assigned to train new PT boat crews at the Melville, Rhode Island training facility. There, he passed on the hard-won knowledge of night navigation, torpedo tactics, and the psychological preparation required to face overwhelming enemy firepower in a wooden boat. "The most important thing I can teach you," Kennedy told a class of newly commissioned PT boat officers in May 1943, "is that fear is not your enemy. Fear is information. It tells you that you're in danger, that you need to be alert, that mistakes will be fatal. The enemy is not fear, it's panic. Panic is what happens when fear overwhelms your training and your judgment. If you can feel fear and still execute your mission, you'll survive. If you panic, you'll die, and you'll probably take your crew with you." It was a lesson forged in the crucible of combat, delivered by a man who had learned it through experience that no training program could replicate. The officers who trained under Kennedy and other Solomon Islands veterans would go on to command PT boats in the Philippines, in New Guinea, in the Mediterranean, and in the English Channel. They would apply the tactics developed in the slot to different geographic and tactical circumstances, adapting and refining the doctrine to meet new challenges. The technological legacy of the PT boat campaign was equally significant. The lessons learned about engine reliability, fuel quality, torpedo performance, and radar effectiveness drove improvements that benefited not just PT boats, but the entire Navy. The Mark 8 torpedo, which had performed so poorly in early engagements due to depth-keeping problems, was redesigned based on feedback from PT boat crews. The radar systems, which had proven inadequate for small boat operations, were upgraded with higher resolution and better target discrimination. Even the basic design of the PT boats themselves was refined, with later models incorporating lessons about hull strength, armament placement, and crew protection. But technology and tactics were only part of the legacy. The PT boat campaign had also demonstrated the importance of decentralized command and individual initiative. Unlike conventional naval operations, where decisions were made by flag officers and transmitted down through rigid chains of command, PT boat operations required junior officers to make life-or-death decisions in real time, with no opportunity to request guidance or approval. This emphasis on individual judgment and initiative would become a defining characteristic of American military culture, distinguishing it from the more rigid and hierarchical approaches of other nations. Admiral William Halsey, in his final report on the Solomon Islands campaign, devoted an entire section to the PT boat contribution. The motor torpedo boat squadrons operating in the Solomon Islands demonstrated that small, relatively inexpensive vessels, properly employed, can achieve strategic effects disproportionate to their size and cost. More importantly, they demonstrated that American sailors, when given proper training and leadership, can match or exceed any opponent in courage, skill, and determination. The PT boat crews did not win the Solomon Islands campaign by themselves, but without their contribution, that campaign would have been significantly longer, more costly, and possibly unsuccessful. It was high praise from a commander not known for sentimentality, and it reflected a genuine appreciation for what the PT boat crews had accomplished. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came not from admirals or historians, but from the Marines who had fought on Guadalcanal and watched the nightly fireworks in the slot, knowing that each explosion represented another Japanese supply ship that would not reach the island, another group of enemy reinforcements that would not arrive to attack their positions. Sergeant John Basilone, a Marine who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on Guadalcanal, wrote in a letter home, "We can hear the PT boats every night, their engines screaming as they race through the slot. Sometimes we see the explosions when they hit Japanese ships. We don't know the names of the guys on those boats, and they probably don't know our names either, but they're out there every night, fighting in the darkness so we can hold this island. That's brotherhood, even if we've never met." This sense of mutual dependence and shared sacrifice was perhaps the most enduring legacy of the PT boat campaign. The crews understood that they were not fighting for abstract strategic objectives, but for the Marines dug into foxholes, for the pilots flying from Henderson Field, for the sailors on the supply ships that kept the island functioning. This personal, immediate connection between their actions and the survival of their comrades created a level of motivation that no amount of patriotic rhetoric could match. As the war progressed and the front lines moved westward across the Pacific, PT boats continued to play significant roles in campaigns from the Philippines to Okinawa. But the tactics, the doctrine, and the spirit that defined PT boat operations all traced their lineage back to those desperate months in the Solomon Islands, when wooden boats crewed by young Americans learned to fight and win against an enemy that had seemed invincible. Lieutenant Kennedy, standing on the dock at Melville and watching a new class of PT boats head out for training exercises, reflected on the journey that had brought him from the darkness of the slot to the relative safety of a training command. He thought about the men who had not survived, about the boats that lay on the bottom of the ocean, about the nights of terror and triumph that had defined his youth. In his personal journal, Kennedy wrote an entry that captured the essence of what the PT boat campaign had meant. "We were not heroes. We were ordinary men, placed in extraordinary circumstances, doing what needed to be done because no one else could do it. We were afraid, but we went anyway. We were outgunned, but we fought anyway. We were told it was impossible, but we did it anyway. That is not heroism. That is simply what Americans do when everything is on the line. We find a way, or we make one." Years later, when Kennedy entered politics and eventually became President of the United States, he would keep a coconut shell on his desk in the Oval Office, a memento from his time in the Solomon Islands, a reminder of the nights when survival was measured in seconds and victory was measured in the distance between a torpedo and its target. Visitors would ask about the coconut, and Kennedy would tell them it was from his time in the Navy, but he rarely elaborated on the full story. The legacy of the PT boat campaign in the Solomon Islands extended far beyond the specific tactical victories or the ships sunk. It represented a fundamental shift in how America approached warfare, emphasizing innovation over tradition, adaptation over doctrine, and individual initiative over rigid hierarchy. These principles, forged in the darkness of the slot and validated through blood and sacrifice, would become defining characteristics of American military culture for generations to come. The wooden boats that had seemed so fragile, so inadequate against the steel might of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had proven to be instruments of strategic transformation. They had not won the war through firepower or armor, but through speed, surprise, and the indomitable spirit of the men who crewed them. They had turned the night from a Japanese advantage into a contested battleground, and in doing so, they had bought the time and space needed for America to mobilize its vast industrial and military potential. As the sun set over Tulagi for the final time in Kennedy's tour, casting long shadows across the water where so many had fought and died, he understood that what they had accomplished would echo through history, not as a footnote to larger battles, but as a testament to what ordinary people could achieve when they refused to accept the limitations that others imposed on them. The PT boats were gone now, replaced by larger, more powerful vessels. But the spirit they embodied, the willingness to face overwhelming odds, the commitment to innovation and adaptation, the belief that courage and skill could overcome material disadvantage, that spirit would endure, passed down through generations of sailors who would look back at the Solomon Islands campaign and understand that sometimes the smallest vessels carry the greatest legacies. The story of the PT boats in the Solomon Islands is more than a tale of naval combat. It's a reminder that innovation, courage, and determination can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. These young Americans, in their fragile wooden boats, changed the course of a war and demonstrated that size and firepower matter less than spirit and ingenuity. If this story of courage and innovation inspired you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible story from World War II. Share this video with anyone who appreciates tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And in the comments below, let us know, what other untold stories from World War II would you like us to explore? Remember, history is not just about the battles that were fought, but about the people who fought them and the lessons they left behind. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.